Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Tower Barnhill. Andrew is from Wilmington, North Carolina. He's currently a graduate student at Duke Divinity School, where he studies divinity and law. As an undergraduate, he spent 2 years as a director of an award-winning National Service Corps and was honored by the Harry S. Truman Scholarship Foundation. And we're proud to say that he is an FTE fellow. So he was also honored by being a part of that fellowship. And we are an organization that seeks to call young leaders, renew the church, and change the world. Andrew is such a young leader that will renew the church and change the world. So it is our privilege and pleasure to mentor him here as he presents as a preacher for the Festival of Young Preachers. Through his experiences in faith-based consulting and interfaith dialogue, Andrew has become interested in the role of the church in the public square. His sermon is entitled, "There Is No Rest, Bringing New Possibilities to Light on Exodus 5 and Sabbath." Please welcome Andrew Tower Barnhill.
Thank you, Matthew. Will you pray with me? Merciful God, you hear us. Even in the midst of our busyness and our preoccupation with anything and everything other than you. You hear us and you love us. May we remember this hour that we are indeed more than our work, that we are of value to you. Oil the hinges of our heart's doors that they might swing gently and openly to your coming. Amen. They're not much older than me. In many ways, they're at the same place on their journeys. Most of them are younger. They always have lots of questions nonetheless. One of the great joys of being at Duke University is serving as a graduate resident to undergraduates in the student body. Among my duties, along with dispensing rock salt on this snowy winter and solving conflicts with roommates, is an opportunity to help these students make sense of where they're going, who they're becoming. But sometimes it's not so easy. We have a tendency to think that who we are is defined by what we do and how far we get. The idea that we are valuable outside of our work is especially foreign to a generation of hyper-competitive millennials seeking just desperately to reach that pinnacle of career success right here, right now. But it often isn't one more line on a resume or one more interview soundbite that is most needed. Sometimes it's rest. Moses and Aaron knew that. Our story of Pharaoh and the brick making is a story of a clash between the culture of constant work and the culture of worship. Do you know that story? It's one we forget. We go to Exodus looking for liberation in the promised land, but we often forget the bricks. Let's take a step back so we can remind each other once again of the story of God. We enter Exodus 5, where Moses and Aaron begin organizing the Israelite workers. It's like an early version of the AFL-CIO. But their lobbying was really just a demand, and it wasn't to a legislative assistant in an outer office somewhere. It was to the Pharaoh himself. They said, hey, the Lord said, let the people go and go into the wilderness. Let them go and Sabbath together and worship their God. But Pharaoh, he didn't get it. His workers were going to work. So Pharaoh laughed off the request, saying, who's this Lord? I don't know him. Why should I let them go? But that wasn't all he did. You want to know what happens next? Well, Pharaoh goes to the overseers in charge of his workers and he says, change of plans. Stop giving the people straw with which to make bricks. Make them get their own straw. And by the way, keep the quota the same. They're lazy. That's why they're calling out to go and worship their God. So the overseers run back and they deliver the news. For the Israelite workers, there is no rest. Does this story sound familiar? Not because you probably heard it at least once or twice in Sunday school, but does it sound familiar because the story of the Israelite workers is our story? For the $7 an hour single parent worker with 3 children at home, there is no rest. For the Manhattan investment banker with the worries of aggravated baby boomers up in arms over their dwindling stock portfolios, there is no rest. For the overburdened caregiver pressed between her own sanity and the needs of her aging relative, there is no rest. So busy answering emails and responding to text messages, we can't even stop to eat. We instead drive while eating, texting, reading, and making other plans, all have you at the same time. Bricks without straw is the false notion that people can find health without equal access to adequate health care. Bricks without straw is the notion that people can live stable lives without adequate pay. Bricks without straw is the notion that people can live happy lives without being given dignity and equality just because of who they love. Bricks without straw is the notion that people can lead lives of meaning without rest. This reality didn't cause our problems, but its existence makes solving them that much harder. Sometimes we need to stop. Self-storage units are now a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States. The cable television show Hoarders, ever seen it? Details the lives of people who just live in homes packed from floor to ceiling with stuff acquired. It shouldn't come as any surprise. For some reason or another, myself included, we like our stuff. And we don't want to give anything up. Not our purchases, not our trash, not even our time. We refuse to displace agency and we refuse to stop. But sometimes we need to do just that. There's an ancient rabbinic tradition that says if we learn to celebrate the Sabbath fully and properly, even once, the Messiah would come. Now this is a striking view for the tradition because it somehow argues that Sabbath is the fulfillment or the completion of a religious life, fully tuned to the ways of God. It makes sense then to look at the Sabbath observance as one of the most reliable and authentic signs of faith. So let's take a moment to look at what Hebrew Scriptures teach about Sabbath. In Exodus, we are told that we should do all our work in 6 days, and on the 7th day not do any, nor should we allow anyone else to work. Not our children, not those who serve us, not the resident aliens, not livestock or animals. Everybody gets that day off. In fact, the biblical idea of Sabbath is even larger than that. Israel's Scriptures command that the land be given a Sabbath, a year of rest for every 7th year, Leviticus 25. Every 7th year, all debts are to be forgiven, Deuteronomy 15. The idea of Sabbath is written even into the creation accounts. God rested on the 7th day. Our Scriptures understand it. Our story tells it. But do we live it? Do we speak the language? If you were to walk into a certain Christmas shop in the state of Washington, you might be drawn in by this sign that's on the door, a small sign. It said, "Christmas spoken here." Christmas spoken here, a nice sign. Wonder if we change that sign to say Sabbath spoken here. What would it mean if we put up such a sign in our churches, in our homes, for our nation? It would mean that the language of Sabbath has become our grammar, our language of existence. The principle of Sabbath is an altogether theological and political language. It's a statement that we are not finally defined by our work. We are not defined by our output or our productivity or our utility. Each being has a value independent of their use. This is the truth of the Sabbath. We are created for joy and love. Others are created for joy and love. The earth is created for joy and love. Let me pause here for a moment. So many times we want a God and a Christianity that comes to us in our work. Most of us really don't believe that we have a value greater than what we do from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day. But Sabbath connects us to a God who loves us even in those hours when we don't feel accomplished. Sabbath commands us to a God who loves us even when we don't feel like we have any value at all. Sabbath reminds us to go away from the world for a moment, to enter a deserted place. Jesus knew that. In Mark 1, we hear it. In the morning, while it was still dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place. It was there, alone with God, that Jesus relaunched his public service. In Luke's gospel, we see on that day before he chose and called the 12 disciples, remember that? He went out where? On a mountain to Sabbath. But it's also about stillness. T.S. Eliot writes, "I said to my soul, be still, and let the dark come upon you. There shall be God." Sabbath isn't just a time for rest, but for deep discernment, for recentering oneself in God and in our truest self. It's where we confess we've lost our way, where we let go of the props that sustain the fantasies and compulsions of the thoughts. It is how we bring ourselves back home. When George Shultz was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, he had this test for every ambassador that would come back from their first visit to another country. He would have them spin the globe in his office and point to the country of which they're from. Well, when Mike Mansfield came back, he pointed to the United States. Now, Schultz is fond of telling that story as a way of reminding us that wherever we go, we shouldn't forget to look after the welfare of our own country. But I think this story can be important to us today because it reminds us that wherever we go, Sabbath can bring us back to God. Places of faith ground us. They center us, almost as if we're floundering beneath the water to poke our heads above. Observance of Sabbath brings us back home. Thomas Merton lived much of his life here in Kentucky at a monastery. He talks about coming to Louisville one time and going to this, really out this corner. He had a revelation at the corner of 4th and Walnut. He said, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness into renewal. Right here. In the Sabbath, we are not faced with lostness and emptiness, but like Merton, with foundness and renewal. Yes, just like Merton, we live in alienating times. Our nation is troubled by wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a growing division between the classes and between those who think all people should have equal rights and those who think we're going too far, too fast. Once more, faith is often misused and misunderstood, both by those who adhere to it and those who do not. But to quote John Stewart, we live now in hard times, not end times. It's our intention to construct a new tale of radical love, to govern by the practice of Sabbath in a world in which there is no rest. It's our intention to reorder ourselves in which there are no distinctions between rich and poor, male and female, black and white, but to reorder ourselves in the Sabbath. It's a daring act of ethical imagination that we might rest. It's a daring act that Pharaoh just didn't understand. It's a daring act that all creation might, for but a few moments, surrender their work to make themselves whole once again. It's an act Pharaoh just didn't understand. It's a daring act that just might be enough to restore our sanity, resurrect our unity, and reignite